Perfect. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the 2020 Dublin Economics Workshop Annual Policy Conference. It's no Wexford, but you're very welcome to Zoom wherever it is that you're coming from. My name is Ronan Lyons. I'm an economist at the SRI and I'm chair of this year's organising committee. And I just want to say a very quick thank you to the organising committee for putting together this year's schedule, which I'm sure you'll all agree brings us some great speakers. Thank you also to the speakers for giving their time over the course of the next week to bring us some great presentations on a variety of different issues that are at the forefront of policy debate in the weeks and months ahead, and years for some of them as well. And then also just to thank Dublin Chamber for their kind and continued sponsorship of the conference. Even though it does take place in Wexford, the Dublin Chamber are always happy to sponsor it, and it's great to have that sponsorship. Also thanks to to TRIS, Trinity Research and Social Sciences, for their great support this year in bringing the conference to you online. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the chair of today's session, which is Dermot O'Leary, and encourage you to use the link that you have, as you're evidently logging in here today, to log on for the rest of the week and to follow the proceedings at each lunchtime, 1 p.m. This week, and then a final session at 4 p.m. on this Friday. So thanks again. Over to you, Dermot.
Thanks, Barra. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining in big numbers today. Probably double what we would have had down in Wexford. I'm Dermot O'Leary. I'm the chief economist in Goodbody, but also importantly a member of the organising committee in the DEW. I have the very easy task of chairing this particular session. I don't even have to tell people where the fire exits are this year. Onto this session. I mean, before this pandemic struck, almost in a different world, we had an election which was basically fought on two key issues. One was health, which is arguably still the biggest issue at this current point in time, and the second issue being housing. The COVID crisis has changed things dramatically, and we'll talk about a lot of these things during the course of this week, but it's likely that it's going to be housing still to the forefront of policymakers' attentions over the next number of years. I mean, this is a broad area, but the focus for us today is on what role the public sector should play in providing homes in Ireland. There is a diverse range of opinions, and we've tried as best as we actually could to give voice to all of those opinions in the session today. And the session is called Providing Affordable Homes, Affordable Housing for All. There are 4 speakers, and they'll all have a maximum of 15 minutes to speak. And there will be Q&A opportunity after those. So I'd encourage you through the Q&A function to get your questions in, and I'll try my best to deal with them. I will be announcing the 4 speakers as they speak, because it'll take a couple of minutes to get up and running. And without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, which is Daniel O'Callaghan. And Daniel is currently an assistant principal in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and is a member of the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service. In his role as a policy analyst, he has undertaken work across a number of areas, including housing, enterprise policy, and the labour market. He has previously worked in the Department of Transport and in the Institute of International and European Affairs. So to kick off the 2020 DEW Irish Economic Policy Conference, it's Daniel O'Callaghan. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Dermot. So I'll just share my screen here, just one second. Okay, so hopefully people can see my slides there. Please let me know if there are any issues. So thanks to Dermot and the organising committee for the invitation to speak today. And as Dermot mentioned, my name is Daniel O'Callaghan. I work in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform as a member of IGEES. And the presentation today is going to focus on some of the work we've done in the area of social housing. So looking at some of the data and analysis that we've produced over the course of the last number of years. So in terms of the structure of what I'm going to say, I'm just going to very initially at the start give an overview of what IGEES is, just for those on the call who mightn't be familiar. I'm going to talk about three main things then. So firstly, a little piece on the wider housing market and the context that people may be familiar with. Secondly, then look at a high level at housing expenditure and the level of output in this area. Going to focus in on then some of the social housing delivery mechanisms and what our research has been able to tell us about cost efficiency in this area. And then I'll wrap up with a few conclusions then at the end. So firstly, in terms of an overview of IGEES. So IGEES was set up in 2012 as an initiative to enhance the level of analytical capacity across the civil service. So there's currently a network of over 200 analysts across all of the government departments. And the network is busy, I suppose, doing research, doing analysis, and there's a large range of publications across a variety of different policy areas available on our website, along with any further information if people are interested and want to find out more. So in terms of the area of housing, so in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, over the last number of years, we've done a number of projects to, I suppose, develop the evidence base in the area of social housing and the state's role in the housing market. We've published a large number of papers as part of the spending review initiative, as part of our social impact assessment series, and as part of our overall expenditure management remit. And really the goal of doing these projects was to develop our understanding of how delivery mechanisms work in practice, what does cost efficiency look like, and then related considerations around how the delivery mechanisms actually work, and what other considerations there are around them. So we've looked at a variety of different things, and I suppose I'm going to base the content of the presentation on those papers today. And I suppose just to note at the outset before I get into the content similar to the published papers, the content of the presentation doesn't necessarily represent the views of the department or the minister. So firstly then, in terms of the wider context of the housing market, so this is relatively well understood. So most people on the call will know most of this, and there will be further, I'm sure, further points on this from the other speakers today. So I won't dwell too much on this, but just to recap, I suppose following the downturn, we've seen very significant price growth and demand growth in recent years. In terms of house prices, we've seen almost a 35% increase between 2015 and 2019. To a position where we're about 18% below the previous peak in 2007, and house price growth relatively flat in the last year, obviously with the impact of COVID still to fully reveal itself. In terms of rental prices, then again, people will be familiar with this, very significant price growth in recent years. In Q4 2019, rent prices were 24% higher than in 2007 nationally, and 32% higher in Dublin. So very significant levels of price growth. In terms of housing output, what's being constructed, what's being built, I suppose the latest statistics for 2019 show that over 21,000 dwellings were completed, both public and private, last year, which is an 18% increase on 2018, and almost double the output of 2016. So increased level of output, but obviously coming from a low base following the economic downturn. And then in terms of social housing specifically, there's obviously a very significant number of households on the social housing waiting list. So in 2019, the latest housing needs assessment, there were just under 70,000 households on the social housing waiting list. So a very significant number of households that have been assessed as being in need of social housing. To note, that is a reduction of around 23,000 households on the 2016 level. So it's come down in recent years, but still a very significant level of outstanding need or demand in the area. So moving on then from the context to overall expenditure and output. So what does that look like in terms of recent years? So this graph here, I suppose, shows the total expenditure related to housing between 2006 and 2020. So in the dark green bars, we can see capital investment in this area, and the gold bars, we can see current expenditure in the area of housing. And I suppose what we can see is a very significant increase in expenditure to 2.8 billion euro in 2020. which is I suppose a level which is above the previous peak in 2008 when the state was spending €2.2 billion in this area. We can also see, I suppose, that there was a large reduction in expenditure from 2008 to 2014, mainly related to the reduced level of capital investment that was seen across a number of policy areas in line with fiscal consolidation. I suppose the other thing to note then is the very significant increase in recent years to 2.8 billion. Also a slightly different ratio in terms of the type of expenditure. So we're at about half and half in terms of, almost half and half in terms of capital to current, whereas previously current expenditure made up 30% or around a third of expenditure back at the previous peak in 2008. So a very significant increase in the level of expenditure. How does the state then deliver social housing support? So there's a variety of different delivery mechanisms. They're quite complex in terms of the number and range of different delivery mechanisms, but at a high level we can think of it in 5 main ways. So we either there's a construction mechanism whereby units are constructed for use as social housing, an acquisition mechanism where second-hand units are acquired for use as social housing, leasing, the leasing of units to be used for social housing. And then there's the rental accommodation scheme, which is a form of short-term leasing, and the housing assistance payment, which is a support to, I suppose, support households to access housing in the private rental market. So a number of different ways the state and through local authorities and AHBs delivers social housing support. So we mentioned I suppose the increase in expenditure in recent years. What has happened to outputs? What's been delivered in recent years? So this chart shows between 2016 and 2019 the level of social housing output in terms of additions to the, I suppose, social housing stock. So the 3 green bars there, hopefully people can make that out, are essentially the build program in recent years. So the dark green shows what's happened to local authority and approved housing body construction in terms of constructing new units. The medium green there, I suppose, shows local authority and approved housing bodies turnkey and Part 5 delivery mechanisms, I suppose, which were the acquisition of newly built units. And then the light green shows the voids program, so bringing social housing units back into use. And then the gold shows acquisitions and the dark grey shows leasing. So we've seen this increase in social housing output from 6,000 in 2016 up to 10,000 units in 2019. And the chart there, I suppose, shows how that's made up in terms of the types of delivery mechanisms. So obviously there's a focus on the level of additional support provided through the social housing delivery mechanisms each year. And as we've mentioned, a significant increase in expenditure and an increase in output. But I suppose it is useful in terms of, as we discuss this policy area and we think about social housing's role in the wider housing market, to acknowledge that there is a very significant stock of social housing support. So if we think about the total number of people that are supported through local authority housing units, approved housing body units, things like rent supplement, RAS, HAP, etc. The data for 2016, I suppose, shows that there's around 250,000 households that are in receipt of housing support in the state. And that equates to approximately 1 in 7 households being supported with their housing needs. So obviously a focus, I suppose, on the annual increases in terms of output and how that's responding to demand, but a very significant, I suppose, stock of social housing also being in place. And then to, I suppose, build on that and think a bit more about how social housing interacts with the wider housing market, this graph just shows the distribution of households by their level of income and their tenure status. So across the bottom axis there, we have the 10 deciles of income as measured by net disposable equivalized income. So the first decile will be the 10% of the lowest income households, all the way up to the 10th decile, which would be the 10% of the highest income households. And I suppose the dark green bars there show the distribution of those who are renting from a local authority. The gold bars show the the households that are owner occupiers, and the dark grey are those that are rented in the private market. And as I suppose we'd expect to see with the social housing recipients of social housing, given it's a targeted scheme that's based on income, the majority of those who are renting from a local authority are in the lower deciles of income. So in the first 4 or 5 deciles of income there, the majority of those renting from a local authority are in those deciles. But we do see, I suppose, in above the 5th decile, a proportion of households, around 14%, that are in the top 5 or the top half of the income distribution. So I suppose, again, useful just to think about the stock of social housing and how the social housing plays a role in interacting with the wider housing market. So moving on then from the overview of social housing expenditure and output, I suppose a lot of the work we've done in recent years has been looking at how social housing is delivered. So as I mentioned before, there's a number of different ways social housing can be delivered, and there's a number of different, I suppose, considerations for how you might deliver social housing. There's considerations such as timing, such as the impact on the market, such as the quality of accommodation, integrated communities, the sectoral capacity, things like the availability of land. There's a variety of different, I suppose, considerations when you look at the different mechanisms and what might be the most appropriate one to use to deliver housing support. But obviously, a really key consideration is cost efficiency. So we've talked about the large amount of expenditure that's being spent on different delivery mechanisms to provide support. And cost efficiency is a really important consideration in terms of value for money and ensuring that appropriate levels of support can be provided given the level of funding that is being spent. So a number of our papers have looked at this question. So can we, I suppose, assess the data and try and look at how cost efficient the different delivery mechanisms are? So these 2 graphs are from a paper we published in 2018 through the spending review process. And I suppose the goal of the paper was to look at the different ways of delivering social housing and try and assess their cost efficiency over the long term. So the methodology used here is similar to previous analysis done by the Housing Agency and the CNAG, and it essentially looks to take what the cost of delivering a unit through each of these mechanisms would be over a 20-year period. So you look at the financial outflows and inflows for each of the mechanisms for a particular type of unit in a particular area. So our paper looked at 6 different local authority areas, and this slide, I suppose, shows 2 of those findings. So on the left here, we have Fingal County Council and the net present cost of delivering a 3-bed unit through each of the delivery mechanisms listed on the below axis. So through local authority construction, through acquisition, through leasing, through HAP, etc. And then similarly on the right then, we have the same results for Tipperary County Council. And again, looking at what the net present cost, or the cost to the state today, of providing social housing through these delivery mechanisms over a 20-year period. And I suppose there's 2 key findings from this. So the first one is that the cost efficiency of providing supports through these mechanisms does differ. So it does differ between the different delivery mechanisms. We can see on the left that in somewhere like Fingal County Council, the cost of providing units through things like leasing or through housing assistance payment is higher than doing so through construction or other delivery mechanisms. But the other key point, I suppose, is this does differ regionally. So in the example of Tipperary on the right, the cost of providing the unit through leasing or through HAP is actually at or below the cost of doing so through construction. So I suppose those 2 key findings are quite important if we want to take cost efficiency into account as we're thinking about how the state might provide social housing or housing support. It is the case that cost efficiency differs by mechanism, but it also differs by region. It's not the case that any one mechanism appears to be much more cost efficient than another in all cases. There is a regional element to this that we need to consider. The second point here is from a paper we did on acquisitions, and I suppose the key point and the point of doing the analysis was to look at how the state delivers social housing through acquiring second-hand units and trying to understand the costs involved there. So the graph here shows the number of units acquired, second-hand units acquired by local authorities between 2016 and 2018. So you can see the distribution there of costs, and the average cost of acquiring a second-hand unit in 2018 was €190,000, and that was a 14% increase on the 2016 level. So it's, as one might expect, as house prices in the wider market increase, and the cost of delivering units through this delivery mechanism increased as well. And again, an important point is the regional variation here. So the average cost of delivering a second-hand unit in somewhere like Leitrim was €105,000, whereas the cost of doing so in Dunleary Rathdown was €315,000. Again, as one might expect, given housing market dynamics, but again, important to keep in mind. As part of that research on acquisitions, we also looked at a number of other questions, such as what type of units are local authorities and approved housing bodies delivering. And when we look at that, we see that the majority of units acquired by local authorities are houses with around 3 bedrooms, whereas approved housing bodies, a more even split between apartments and housing. So again, trying to develop the evidence base around what these programs are producing in terms of the types of units. And then another question which we did some initial analysis on at quite a high level was, how does this delivery mechanism of acquiring second-hand units impact the wider market? So again, quite difficult to look at in terms of methodology. We looked at it just in terms of the proportion of units measuring up the local authority acquisitions against transactions in the wider housing market. And looking at it that way, we see that around the local authority acquisitions equate to around 4% of transactions in the private housing market. But there are areas of the country, in terms of when we look at it on a postcode basis, where that can be a higher level, so between anywhere from 10 to 15% of transactions being local authority second-hand purchases. So again, quite a key consideration with this delivery mechanism, and something that might merit further analysis in the future. Finally then, I suppose, in terms of building on the work we've done to date, we're currently undertaking a piece of research to look at the social housing build programme in more detail. So in terms of the build programme and delivering constructed units, there's different types of units in terms of local authorities being involved in delivering units, approved housing bodies, and there's the delivery of specific units for recipients that have specific needs through the capital assistance scheme as well. So there's different bodies involved in terms of delivering units, and they have different ways of doing it. So again, there can be direct build mechanisms where units are directly managed and built by these bodies. There's turnkey mechanisms, which involves the acquisition of newly built units, and the Part 5 delivery mechanism, which people will probably be familiar with, which I suppose places requirements on private developments to generate social housing. So we're going to look at this using a number of local authority case studies, so picking out maybe 6 local authorities, trying to generate a bit more evidence on what the unit cost of delivering additional units through each of these mechanisms are, and looking at some of the other considerations, such as how long does it take to deliver units through these processes, and other things in terms of what types of units are being delivered, how long that takes, etc. So that's something that we're currently looking at. So just to conclude, and just to mention, I suppose, across the IGEES network, and I did mention that there are IGEES staff across the government departments, just to mention some of the related work that's been done. So the Department of Housing has undertaken 2 different surveys, which are of use and of relevance if people are interested to go and look at those. There's a survey of housing preferences of renters, and also an attitudinal survey of mature homeowners. So again, trying to generate some data and insights to try and understand the housing market a bit better. They've also got a joint work programme with the ESRI, looking at things like house price developments, and some recent work on the impact of COVID on the rental market. The Department of Finance has been involved with the Department of Housing on those survey works, and they also produce a housing and property market chart pack on a regular basis, which provides an interesting overview of data. The Department of Transport have done.
Sum up, please.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, just to conclude, I suppose, just to emphasise again, it's a very significant policy area. It's part of the overall housing market. In recent years, we've seen a really significant increase in expenditure, and there's a variety of different ways through which social housing is provided. And cost efficiency then is a really important consideration. And when we've looked at that through our research projects, I suppose we've shown that cost efficiency does differ by mechanism, and it also differs by region. I think that's something, a really important point to consider in the debate. And then lastly, I suppose there's a number of related areas which would merit further analysis, but given time, I won't mention those. So that's it for me. Thanks very much.
Daniel, that's great. Really good context for the next three speakers. I'm going to get right back into it and introduce our next speaker, who is Eoin O'Brien, TD, who's going to be familiar to a lot of you on the call. He is Sinn Féin spokesperson on housing and a TD for Dublin Midwest since 2016. Prior to that, he was a councillor on South Dublin County Council. He is the author of many books, the latest of which is entitled Home, Why Public Housing is the Answer. Might give you a bit of hint what he's going to go through in his presentation there. But a lot of the ideas in that particular book are central to Sinn Féin's housing policy. Eoin, thanks for giving us your time, and it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Dermot, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. What I'm going to do is maybe in about 10 minutes, just fly through some headline items that may make some of them seem a little bit simplistic, but hopefully we'll get into the meat of them in the question and answer session. And I suppose that the central point I want to raise is that for far too long, our debate around affordable housing has simply focused on supply, as if supply in and of itself will deliver homes to rent and buy for working people at prices they can genuinely afford. And of course, as I'm going to make the case over the next few minutes, unfortunately, it's not that simple. And unless you have the right kind of supply through the right kinds of mechanisms, genuine affordability will unfortunately remain beyond reach of far too many people. So maybe we could move to the first slide, if possible. So look, this is stuff that everybody knows, but it's just worthwhile repeating. Obviously, COVID-19 has had an impact on our housing system, as it has on all aspects of society and the economy. And it's important to name some of those things. So obviously, we've seen a slowdown in private sector commencements. We're also seeing a slowdown in both private and council mortgage drawdowns, either because lenders obviously are nervous or people are impacted by income loss, or buyers themselves are getting cold feet and at least temporarily putting off the possibility of purchasing. We've also a number of pre-COVID trends that are clearly continuing. So we're still losing rental stock. Figures from the Residential Tenancies Board will show us the number of registered tenancies continues to decline. And really what's more important than the number of landlords is the number of tenancies themselves, and that's a real issue. Still, far too much of what has been built, particularly in our big urban areas, is the wrong kind of development. So are this in co-living, apart hotels, or high-end expensive apartments, rather than good quality homes for people to live in. And I suppose my central point is that the development model that's been used by the private sector, private developers, is simply broken. And on that basis, all of the data we have from all of the surveys, including the most recent Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland report on all-in development costs, shows that private developers cannot deliver genuinely affordable homes for certain cohorts of people. And therefore, we should just stop asking them to do so and find other ways of dealing with that. Next slide, please. However, there are also some opportunities that are arising in the era of COVID. And the first is while there may be a private sector slowdown, including sites that can't get developed because of viability issues, this does provide an opportunity for public acquisition and building out of those developments in a way that may actually increase the volume of genuinely affordable homes. So what we often call turnkeys, that were in the construction stats that Daniel outlined, but are really another form of acquisition. There could well be opportunities for significant volumes of those over the next number of years. Also, obviously, the cost and the general climate, including the EU climate for government borrowing, particularly for investment in critical infrastructure such as housing, has never been better. There's clearly a strong need, as the ESRI have made the case most recently, for a counter-cyclical investment to boost the economy and employment. And crucially, and this speaks to the point Dermot made at the start, public demand for real policy change and genuine affordable rental and purchase accommodation has never been greater. So given all of those things, the current government has a very, very strong fair wind behind them to do the kinds of things that are required to develop the homes that people require. Next slide, please. So look, again, at the risk of simplifying, let me give you some bad policies which I think people should avoid. And I'll be making the case for why the government shouldn't pursue these in the time ahead. And then I'll conclude with the kinds of policies I think are necessary. So the first is we currently have low levels of public sector investment in affordable homes. If you take the capital spend that Daniel referred to, about 1.2 billion of that is for social and affordable housing, but only a very small portion of that is for a thing called the Service Sites Fund, which is the primary mechanism that the outgoing Fine Gael government had for the delivery of affordable homes. Now, no homes have actually been delivered through that mechanism yet. The first 50 will be ready later this year. But we are simply not investing enough in the delivery of genuinely affordable homes to rent or buy, and that's a problem and if it continues. Something that I'm sure that's likely to upset one of our other speakers, Michelle, and I say that in jest, is the Land Development Agency. And unless the final draft of the legislation on the LDA is radically different from the general scheme of the bill that we scrutinised in the Oireachtas Housing Committee at the end of last year, the LDA is actually going to be an impediment to large-scale delivery of good quality affordable homes to rent and buy, particularly because government, and certainly the outgoing government, was keen to set it up as a DAC off balance sheet, with significant portions of public land being used for unaffordable open market price sale, but also even the affordable homes being part funded through private equity finance, pushing up the prices beyond what will effectively be affordable for many working people. My big concern at the minute, however, is actually with the growing demand from the private sector, and people will have read about this again in the newspapers yesterday, for the government to introduce a government-backed shared equity loan for private home purchases. Probably one of the worst ideas I've come across in a long time. The idea that you can borrow up to 25% of the market price of a home in Dublin, for example, well beyond the 3.5 times required by the central bank, through a second loan, lower, no interest, guaranteed by the state. And the difficulty, of course, is it locks in unsustainably high prices. It means working families are paying far too much for properties over the long term. The equity stake is a percentage of the market value of the home, which means as the price or the market value of the home increases, so too does the amount the purchaser has to pay. But also, the taxpayer takes a big risk, because if we had another property crash in the future, the fall in the value of the equity stake would mean the taxpayer, of course, makes a loss. So while the developer banks in full market prices, the home buyer and ultimately the taxpayer takes an additional risk. So something that may or may not be in the upcoming budget and one to watch. And then the other point is just to make the chronic over-reliance on the private sector to meet social housing needs. While generally we talk about this in terms of its negative impact on social housing tenants, it also has a big impact on affordable renters and affordable purchasers, because we currently have 100,000 households between HAP, RAS, rent supplement, and long-term leasing, all living in private rental properties subsidised by the state. That's a third of all rental properties, and therefore that has an impact on the availability and the price of rental properties, and potentially first-time buyer properties in the private market. So it's not just good for social housing tenants to get them out of the private rental sector into proper, real social housing tenancies led by approved housing bodies or local authorities. It's also good for affordability and supply in the private rental sector and the first-time buyers market outside of social housing supports. And then finally, to the last slide, I'm going to try and keep to my 10 minutes, Dermot, you'll be happy to know. I suppose the kinds of policies we think, or I think in the party has been arguing for some time, is we need a dramatically increased investment by government in public housing. And by public housing, I don't just mean social housing, subsidised social rental tenancies. I also mean large volumes of affordable cost rental units, as well as affordable purchase units, which I'll come to in a second. And when you look at the level of need, because while Daniel's right, the local authority housing waiting lists have gone down, that's in part because we've moved a very large number of households from rent supplement into HAP. And one of the things that happens when you do that is they're taken off the principal list. But actually, if you take all of those on local authority waiting lists, along with those on HAP and other leasing schemes, other than the long-term leasing, we probably actually need about 140,000 real social houses owned and managed by local authorities and approved housing bodies over the next decade to meet current and future need. So the level of demand out there is much greater. The way we would deliver that is to have very, very ambitious 5-year regional housing plans based on the regional housing systems and housing markets across the country, led by local authorities, but also with greater involvement of approved housing bodies and community housing trusts. We also urgently need a clearly defined affordable housing scheme. The Minister says he's going to announce one later this month, and we'll comment on that when we see it. But that needs clear definitions of affordability. For rents, the ESRI and some of the work that Daniel mentioned earlier in terms of the Department of Housing's project with the ESRI has done good work on this, combining a percentage of household income coupled with an ability to afford an ordinary basket of goods. But that needs to be very clear, and I've indicated my own kind of preference there. But likewise, with affordable purchase homes, we need to avoid this idea of thinking of affordability as the market price minus a discount, and instead put in place a model that looks at full cost recovery of the development and that produces good quality apartments, houses and duplexes in Dublin, for example, at prices of 230,000 or less, and that's out without any hidden equity charge. And the key to all of this, of course, is a very simple principle, which is never sell the land. We need to build up a stock of permanently affordable homes, not just to rent, but to buy, which would be outside of the private market. And how you do that is you sell the homes at the price I've mentioned, leasehold, under covenant. So those houses are the property of the home buyer, but those people never own the land. And if they want to sell in the future, they sell back into the affordable housing scheme at the discounted rate, say index linked for inflation or home improvements, etc. We also need to improve the delivery of public housing. And too often, local authorities are much maligned, although it's interesting, they've met almost all of the targets that have been set for them by central government under Rebuilding Ireland. The problem, those targets are too low. So what we need is more ambitious targets and then greater resourcing of a thing called the Housing Delivery Office, which is a function of the City and County Managers Association, to assist in ensuring local authorities are meeting the level of need that's there. We also need to reform the public spending code. The idea that it takes 18 months from the day a housing manager in a local authority decides they want to build some houses to the day a brick is laid in the ground is absolutely bizarre. And in fact, it's something that is probably the single biggest reform that we need, particularly for large public housing projects of 20 million or more. And the last, of course, is we need an active land management agency. The original design of the Land Development Agency was to be such a thing. Unfortunately, how it's currently constituted, it's going to have only minimal compulsory purchase order powers and only be able to work with landowners with their consent. And we really need to start getting the issue of land management, public and private, take it much more seriously, not only so we can deliver good quality and large volumes of affordable public homes, but also to dampen market prices as well. So my very last point is this. I mean, in the slide I said at the start, or the bullet point at the start, I was saying about 50% of all commencements, in my view, need to be non-market housing. Social, affordable cost rental, affordable leasehold purchase, led by local authorities, approved housing bodies and community housing trusts. That would mean about 20,000 units a year. And while I don't think you can do that overnight from the 9,000 or 10,000 that were delivered last year, that needs to be a central objective of government policy, alongside another objective, which I'll end on, which is driving other policy instruments to bring the price of housing, the all-in development cost of housing, the private sector down further. And that's something we can get into in the Q&A. Thanks, Dermot.
Thanks, Eoin. That's great. And yes, they will be definitely issues that we'll be getting in the Q&A, and I'm sure our next two speakers actually will address some of the issues you brought up as well. Just a reminder, we're going to be using the Q&A function. So there's a good number of questions in already, so get your questions in as quick as you can. But we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Michelle Norris, who is Professor of Social Policy in UCD. Her research interests focus on housing policy and urban regeneration. She has led over 20 research projects on these issues over the last 20 years or so, and produced over 170 publications. She's been a very busy person. She's a member of the National Economic and Social Council, is chair of the Housing Finance Agency, and she also sits on the board of the Land Development Agency. Michelle, thanks again, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Dermot, and thanks for inviting me along to speak. I'm going to talk today about issues around the provision of social housing, but I'm focusing specifically on what I call real social housing, in other words, social housing provided by approved housing bodies and by local authorities. And I'm going to talk in particular about the impact of land and financing mechanisms on social housing provision. So my paper today draws on a book I'm writing at the moment, which looks at resilience and fragility of social housing sectors in Western Europe. So it looks at what are the internal design factors that have made some sectors in Western Europe very resilient, and they've continued to grow over the last 30 years. While other sectors, including the Irish sector, have shrunk. So I look at a range of different countries around Europe in the book, but today I'm going to look at, in particular, two other small European countries which have a lot in common in Ireland with Ireland, and they are Denmark and Austria, and look at some of the lessons Ireland can learn from these countries. Much larger social housing sectors. Social housing is 24% of the housing stock in Austria. It's 19% in Denmark. And they're also more robust than the Irish system. So the Danish social housing sector has doubled in size since 1960. And the Irish social housing sector has contracted by 50% over the same time. And as we'll go on and see, they're also cheaper to run. Just other point to make starting off, Dermot mentioned at the start, I'm a member of the board of both the Housing Finance Agency and Land Development Agency, but I just wanted to mention that my paper today is in my academic capacity and a reflection of my personal views, not the views of either agency. The picture in the back of the slide is Karl Marxhof in Vienna, which is one of the largest and kind of most famous interwar social housing schemes built in Vienna. And I included it because I thought it would be a bit of fun to mention Karl Marx at the Dublin Economics Workshop. Now, I just have 15 minutes, so I'm going to start by using a trick I recommend my students use in their exams. And that is, I'm going to set up my conclusions first in case I run out of time at the end. So my argument is that a higher level of social housing provision are key to addressing housing unaffordability and supply problems. I can't see how it can be done otherwise. This is going to require additional public investment, but also measures to reduce delivery costs and barriers to new building and barriers to achieving the particular type of social housing we need. And then, just by comparing Ireland and Denmark and Austria, I'm going to identify some of what I think are the key problems in the Irish social housing sector. So these costs are decoupled from rents and subsidies. The value of historic public subsidies are not retained and reused in the system. And a similar point actually to the point Eoin's made earlier on, in my view, land acquisition for social housing is very problematic and needs to be reformed. And the way in which we acquire land is both costly for social housing landlords, but it's also risky and impacts on the type of housing they can provide and they can develop. So the session asks, how can we provide affordable housing for all? And as I said in the first point of my conclusions, in my view, particularly for low-income households, it's European history demonstrates that it's not possible without significant social housing output and particularly in the context of strong population growth and market failure to provide sufficient amounts of affordable housing. So this graph looks at population trends in the three countries since 1901, and I thought it was worth including this and flagging this at the start of my comments, because most other European countries experienced a huge population boom in the middle of the 20th century. And they responded by very large social house building programs, which academics call the golden age of social house building. This includes Denmark and Austria. Now, Ireland didn't experience a population boom at that time. We experienced population contraction. But we're now currently experiencing a very, very large increase in population, similar to what our European counterparts experienced in the middle of the 20th century. And we're also experiencing very strong barriers to market output of housing at affordable levels. So it's very hard to see how, without higher levels of social housing, we can address this, because no other developed country has managed to do it in the past without relying on very poor quality private accommodation at any rate. I think this is not a contentious view that additional social housing will require additional public investment. And as Eoin mentioned, there are lots of other arguments for additional public moment in social housing. Stimulus, badly needed stimulus for private sector jobs. But one issue is that social housing provision in Ireland is already comparatively expensive compared to other countries. So just to illustrate that, I've just put forward in this graph, it's just Eurostat data on public spending on social housing and also on housing allowances, including RAS, HAP, etc. Now in Denmark and Austria, social tenants qualify for housing allowances, whereas here it's just private tenants. And I mentioned in the footnote, robust cross-country comparison is challenging, so I'm happy to take some questions on the problems in that later if people are interested, or you're welcome to email me. But you'll see from the graph in 2017, spending in Ireland on social housing and social housing supports, as they're called, was 7.5 times higher than that of Austria, even though the Irish population is half the size of Austria, and our social housing sector is also half the size of the social housing sector in Austria. So why is Irish social housing more expensive than its Danish and Austrian counterpart? I don't think it's because the social landlords are more efficient than their Danish and Austrian counterpart. In some ways, it's the opposite. But it's mainly because our funding model is unusual. We use an unusual funding model to fund social housing. And also we fail to retain and recycle the value of historic subsidies in our social housing sector. So how social housing is funded is rarely discussed in the public debate. So just in case people aren't clear, I'll just outline briefly how we fund social housing. There's two broad models, depending on the type of housing. So council housing and also approved housing body supported housing, in other words, housing with kind of care supports, is funded with 80 to 100% central government capital grants. Councils usually receive 80%, and then they top it up from internal capital receipts from the sale of council housing, ironically. And then local authorities and AHBs charge rents which are related to income. So the most recent figures we have is that the average rent in social housing is £52 or €52 a week. And then AHBs also receive a very modest flat rate rent supplement on top of that. And then social housing provided by approved housing bodies for general needs, in other words, standard family or housing for people who don't require support. It's funded by the following way. They receive a 30% government loan called CAF, and it's a bullet loan. In other words, it's all repayable at the end of the term. They top that up with a 70% annuity loan, just like a mortgage. They repay capital and interest, which they get from banks or often from the Housing Finance Agency. They charge an income-related rent of average of €52 a week as well. And then they get up to 92% of the market rent the government or the dwelling would have got in the private sector. So with an income-related rent plus 92% of market rent, probably the rent roll is above 100% of the market rent. So what are the implications of that for the kind of costs of delivering social housing in Ireland, and why is our system more expensive than Denmark and Austria? First issue is all capital spending on Austrian social housing is off balance sheet. It's not on part of government spending, and in most spending on Danish social housing is off balance. Whereas everything in Ireland is on balance sheet. So obviously that immediately makes everything appear much more expensive. AHBs have only been included in on balance sheet in recent years following the Eurostat decision. And there are strong benefits associated with trying to get them back off balance sheet in terms of the resilience of the sector, the ability of the sector to raise funds. That's what the Danish and Austrian example demonstrates. In my view, it's going to be very challenging to achieve without really radical change to the funding model for the sector. And further complication is policymakers may not want to do this because it does mean less control over the sector. So that may not be attractive to policymakers. There are good policy decisions for wanting to control what social landlords do. Second reason why our model is relatively expensive is that in both Austria and Denmark, both government subsidies and also the rents tenants pay are linked to costs and the actual cost of service delivery. Now, obviously costing delivery of a service can be challenging, but it does mean that there is a funding model which promotes cost control, because obviously tenants don't want to pay rents or what they think are excessive. In Ireland, by contrast, rents are decoupled from costs are decoupled from rents and subsidies. So in the city council sector, the Department of Housing tries to control costs by, as Eoin mentioned, very detailed control over costings. But the real problem in the sector is that the rents don't reflect costs, and in rural areas the rents are probably enough to cover costs, but in urban areas we know where they have a larger and older housing stock, they don't cover management and maintenance. But the issue is these costs don't disappear, they materialise in higher refurbishment costs and spending on voids and things like that, refurbishment of voids in the long term, they don't disappear. In the AHB sector, revenue subsidies reflect market rents, as I mentioned. To my mind, that appears to be an expensive subsidy system, but also it provides weak incentives to control costs where the rents are high and your costs are relatively low, where you're generating a surplus. Another problem is that in areas where development costs are high, parts of the country where development costs are high but rents are low, Limerick City would be an example. This development model can make AHB development unviable, or the funding model rather can make AHB development unviable. And then kind of my third point about the difference in costs relates to the failure to retain the value of historic subsidies within our social housing sector. And use them to deliver cheaper services today. So in Denmark and Austria, sales or privatization of social housing is very low. So it means that dwellings that were paid for in the 1950s and public subsidies that were given out to pay for dwellings in the 1950s are still providing social housing in 2020. In Ireland, by contrast, we have been selling council houses to tenants at a discount since the 1930s, and 2/3 of all the council houses ever built were sold to tenants. So currently they're being sold at a 40 to 60% discount from market value, and 500 dwellings were sold in 2018. And the programme for government, the current government, talks about reducing that discount, which in my view is necessary. What's less widely appreciated is that when development loans on AHB housing are repaid, these dwellings can be relet at market rents. So the AHB sector is relatively new, so this hasn't been a big issue to date, but just to flag, loan finance for the sector was introduced in 1991, so it's going to become an increasing issue as increasing numbers of AHB dwellings will move into this category. And then just a final point on land. I entirely agree with Eoin O'Brien's comments that land management for social housing and housing in general, and active land management is necessary in the country. And one of the other reasons why social housing provision in Denmark and Austria is cheaper and also less volatile in terms of rising and falling is that both countries actively manage land supply for social housing and also the cost of land supply. So in Vienna, for instance, there is a non-profit off-balance sheet organization called WOM Fund, it means residential fund, that buys land for social housing long in advance of developments when it's cheaper. And also there's limits on how much this organization can sell on to social landlords, the land, just to keep land prices down. Irish social landlords, in contrast, have to go out and buy land at market value. And generally, they do this by borrowing, and traditionally local authorities borrowed from the Housing Finance Agency for this purpose. So obviously this drives up costs if they're having to go out and buy. But the more significant issue is it drives up risks. It discourages them from doing that because councils and AHBs have to borrow for land acquisition. So that's a big risk. You borrow to buy land, but they can't always be sure they'll get planning permission in some cases, or they'll get Department of Housing funding to build on the housing. So it's quite an unattractive proposition for them compared to going out and buying turnkey developments. It was mentioned earlier that this can have impacts on costs, and that's certainly true in terms of driving up costs. But another significant impact of the land access problems is its impact on the types of developments we're building. So the vast bulk of the social housing stock is 3, 4, and 5 bedroom units. It reflects the traditional family structure we had in the country and who qualified for social housing. But most people on waiting lists are either single people or lone parents with small families, one child, and also most people in homeless accommodation are small units. So they need our small households. So they need small units, and small units are very difficult to deliver via the turnkey model and really require new building. And also for supported housing, where a housing association, for instance, might be housing older people with mobility issues or people with disabilities, and they need to build from scratch. It's very challenging for those small organisations to get access to land. So adopting a more active land management model, I feel would be a very valuable change in the social housing sector. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. It's brilliant. And we'll get back. I think there's some questions coming in for you already as well. So get your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom. Moving right along. So our final speaker is Ronan Lyons, and he's Assistant Professor of Economics at Trinity College Dublin, where he's also Director of Trinity Research in Social Sciences. His research focuses on housing markets, urban economics, and economic history. He's a consultant to the IMF on residential property prices, a frequent contributor to national and international media on Irish housing and their broader economy, and the author of quarterly daft.ie reports on the Irish housing market, and he is a member of the organising committee of the DEW. So if he goes over his time, he's going to be in real trouble. Over to you, Ronan.
Thanks very much, Dermot, for that. What I will do is I will try and stick to 10 minutes so we get more time for discussion afterwards. What I want to do is probably vehemently agree and sometimes vehemently disagree with some of the earlier speakers, but in particular what I want to do is add a little bit of meat on the bones in terms of the scale and the mix of the housing need that we have. So Michelle mentioned that unique in Europe, we saw population fall in the 20th century. Unique in Europe, we will see our population growth increase this century compared to last century. And if you look at the latest population projections made in 2016, we're expecting a population in the 26 counties anyway of between 5.6 and 6.7 million by 2051. And in the first 4 years of that are already progressed. We're close to the upper end of that particular scale. So if you do the numbers, you don't have to worry about the table on the right-hand side there. We're closest so far to the high migration, low fertility scenario of a few years ago. And depending on which household size you think we'll end up at mid-century, we'll need something like 3.1 million dwellings by the 2050s. Obviously, these all have to be taken as round numbers rather than exact numbers. But to give you an idea of the scale, 3.1 million homes. We currently have about 1.7 million dwellings that are in use. Now, it gets worse, because worse in a growth sense is good, I suppose, but we have to build homes for all these extra households, and we're going to lose some of our existing dwellings because of obsolescence. And not only that, because we are urbanizing fast, well, again, we missed the urbanization train in the 20th century, we are going to have to do it in the 21st century. And that means obsolescence is going to be higher than it has been before. If you think about people migrating from rural to urban parts of the country, that means that more of your rural housing stock falls out of use. So how many thousand homes are we going to need every year on average if you take the population figures on the last slide and then try the different obsolescence and household size amounts? Somewhere between 40 and 60,000 homes. If you take, say, 2.1 average household size with a 0.6% obsolescence rate, you end up with something like 49,000 homes per year. And here I will vehemently agree with Eoin about, depending, it's a policy preference, but somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of those should be social housing homes. I will vehemently disagree with Eoin now, with respect, of course. Supply is the single most important factor in determining the affordability of homes. The more, the greater fraction of the income distribution we can get able to afford to cover the full costs of their housing, the more supply we'll get, and the more that will bring the cost of housing down. Those two scatter plots, and Dermot has similar ones that he sends to his mailing lists. It's how many homes are, what is the supply on the sale or rental market in Dublin at a particular point in time, and what happens afterwards. In both sale and rental markets, the more homes there are available, the more prices fall. People like to think economics doesn't work in housing, supply and demand don't work in housing, but it does. And I'm going to switch back to vehemently agreeing with Eoin and saying, but we can't expect the market to do 100%. What we need to be thinking of is, and again, it's a policy preference, what is the fraction of the income distribution that we think we're going to need to support in terms of social housing? Is it 10, 20, 30, 40%? But we look at the history, and Michelle mentioned a little bit about the history of the Irish housing system and the Irish social housing system. Dublin housing, or Cork or Galway housing, does not need to be more expensive than anywhere else. The reason it becomes more expensive, and this is to underscore the point about supply, is when you do not build enough homes, and when you do not build enough homes, in particular in the locations that they're needed. And as Ireland goes from previously, like 50 years ago, 45% urban, currently 65% urban, and in about 50 years' time, we'll probably be something like 85% urban, maybe 90% urban. As we do that, we will need to build more homes in the cities and towns, and, as Michelle mentioned, almost all of the additional housing stock we're going to need is going to be for 1- and 2-person households. We talk so much about families and family homes and building for families and making sure things are affordable for families, but we will never need any more family homes if we chose to build different housing stock. No matter which population projection you use, we will never have enough families to occupy the family homes we have already built in this country. So the margin, the new housing we need, is for 1- and 2-person households, and it's in urban areas. But, as Michelle mentioned, that is the most expensive type of housing to build. The smaller the household, the more expensive it is per person up front, and of course, that's going to be more expensive in urban areas when there's an opportunity cost of land than in rural areas. And no matter if you can exclude taxes, you can exclude land costs, you can exclude profit. We get Karl Marx another mention. We'll have some sort of Karl Marx dream where nobody gets any profit. There's no cost to land. You will still face the reality that building something in Ireland is one of the most expensive places in the world to build something. If you build medium density, medium spec apartments in Ireland, in any city in Ireland in the Republic, it is more expensive, significantly more expensive than in Belfast, or significantly more expensive than in Vienna or Copenhagen or Barcelona or any city you want to choose, apart from London and Paris in Europe. We have to get to the bottom of that. And what this looks like, to move from sort of figures into more diagrammatic outline, is we need to get rid of this B group here. So what is this? You've got the population by income, right? So as you go from left to right, you've got higher income households. And this dashed line in the middle is what the cost of your housing, or if you're older, your housing and care needs are. As you get richer, obviously you're more able to meet those costs yourself. And there should be no gifts, there should be no state subsidies for people who could afford it themselves. Are you listening? Help to Buy scheme, for example. But the problem is not that the richest households are getting a state subsidy. That is a problem if that happens. The problem is that the line between viability and the threshold for state support, those two lines do not overlap. So you end up with a group that are too rich to qualify for state support and too poor to afford the basic minimum specification of housing for them. And that's the group B in the middle there. So the policy goal has to be to eliminate that group B. Not by getting rid of them, but by moving them either into C or A. Either you choose to provide them with support, or you choose a different set of policies that they can afford something in the market. There's only a social and a market group. There isn't some group in the middle. And that kind of brings me to the 4 principles that I have for a healthy housing system, and I'll go into a bit more detail on the housing for all afterwards. The first is you need macroprudential rules. Right? You want to link prices to the real economy. That's key, to use sort of the jargon bit, to why, where Y is incomes of the real economy. The second principle you need to link, just as the macroprudential rules link prices to the real economy, you need to link costs to the real economy as well. It is simply not acceptable that build costs in Ireland are among the highest in the world. This should not be an expensive place to build. We're quite low density. Right? We should not be an expensive place to build, and we need to find out why. And if you do not do that, then you will not be able to ensure that prices and costs, in other words, viability, is adequate. And we've ended up in a situation a couple of years ago where if you took Dublin City Council, only the 10% richest households in the country would be able to afford a minimum spec 2-bed apartment without it being a burden on their income. And that's just simply not acceptable for Ireland. The third, and this is probably the key one for this session, is cost rents. We need to ensure, where you don't have the market income to cover your costs, that you get a top-up, an income subsidy, so that you meet your cost rent. This builds on both what Eoin and Michelle were talking about in terms of cost rental systems. I think the version I have is probably a little bit different to Owen's, but I'll get into that. One of the things this does, if done right, is it moves the system from begging the developer for 10% or 5% or 20% of their units to having social housing effectively as anchor tenants in for-profit developments. That the for-profit developers will go to housing bodies and say, please, will you take the first 20, 25, 30% of these? Because if you do that, we'll give you them at cost, and because that will lower our finance costs. So getting social housing first rather than social housing last. A whole bunch of other positive aspects to cost rents compared to current systems we're using. But that, I think, is probably one of the key ones. And the fourth element it's been mentioned a couple of times, so I'll just kind of double down or triple down on it, is a land value tax. Build costs are not the only costs you face, land costs are there as well. And by putting in place a land value tax, as I mentioned, I think in the next slide, ownership becomes completely irrelevant. The state doesn't have to own anything because it gets the rent anyway. So why cost rents? And this is kind of expanding a little bit on the housing for all bit. The first, and here's probably where I'll be very different to Eoin, is no state-owned homes. There is an inherent conflict of interest in the state or the local authority owning the home that you live in, and then bits of that same unit trying to seek your vote. And Michelle mentioned this. We've seen leaky buckets, as Colin McCarthy calls them, where all the social housing built in a certain way gets sold off as huge gifts. Any kind of political link between how you live and who you vote for needs to be broken. And not only that, if you have local authority only housing, with the best will in the world, it is segregated. I think we need to integrate our housing across income and demographics. We could be in a position in 30, 40, 50 years' time where households on any income will be able to live in state-owned housing, but that's certainly not going to be a good use of taxpayer money now. to start giving state-built homes to our richest households. And the second, it's the same as Michelle said, support should be based on cost rent, not market rent. Social housing needs to be counter-cyclical or at least acyclical and not pro-cyclical. This means, incidentally, avoiding at all costs the label of affordable homes. You're either in the market or you're in social housing. This idea of affordable homes as some sort of social housing for middle-class people who don't want to be accused of being in social housing, that has to go. And just shared equity got to mention earlier, shared equity is a lesser evil than Help to Buy. Help to Buy is effectively a gift to higher income households. Shared equity gives the state an upside. If you cannot reduce costs straight away, shared equity is one way of transitioning from high cost Ireland to lower cost Ireland in 5 or 10 years time, while still getting responsive housing supply now. And the last principle is integrating social housing and housing policy more generally with other policies like education policy. Getting a mix of demographics at early ages is going to lead to high quality schools in all neighborhoods and for all people, for all children. Health policy, as you get older, you need a mix of housing and care, and that needs to be part of your cost rent. And pension policy, we currently have a system hugely skewed in favor of ownership, and we need to balance that playing field. So to close out, in pictures and trying to move away from tables, if we think of the Irish housing system in 2000, it was effectively one of uniformity, right? You stayed at home until eventually you got your own family home, and then maybe you went into a nursing home or a funeral home, but that was kind of it. That's your life cycle in housing in Ireland, pretty uniform. There will always obviously be a need for the family home segment, but one of the key points I was trying to make today is that it does not necessarily need to get any bigger if we use our housing stock well. What we do need to do is we need to add a whole host of different housing types that we do not currently have. Purpose-built student accommodation. I'm going to mention co-living because let's have a debate, right? Is it going to be 0,000, 1,000 or 2,000? In a country of 2 million or 3 million dwellings, I'm not sure it needs that much focus. But there's certainly, I think, some scale for it. What I think there's much more of a need for is urban core medium to high rise living for pre and no family households, and suburban low to medium density for post family households. And also, that's not in Ireland, that is an independent living complex and an assisted living complex. Two types of housing that we're definitely going to need given our age profile, but we don't have currently. So I'll close on that, looking forward to the discussion. And if you'd like to get in touch or like to get the slides or whatever, just let me know and I'll stop sharing there.
That's great, Ronan. Thanks very much, and thanks to Eoin, Michelle, and Daniel as well. We have about 20 minutes. We're doing pretty good, and we have a hell of a lot of questions in already. So my apologies, but we're not going to get through all of them. So I'm just going to try and group them as best I can to give everyone an opportunity. But maybe just starting off, and I'll maybe call on Eoin first of all to give his response in relation to this. You know, when this debate happens in Ireland about, you know, who should be building, should it be the private sector, should it be the public sector, it often goes down in kind of black and white. You know, in your presentation, you did say that there's a role there for the private sector. When we look at the numbers, and there was a very interesting piece in the Irish Times last week by Dr. Anthony Ledden, which I'm sure you saw, who one of the conclusions was that what the local authorities actually produce is a relatively small number of expensive housing units, and putting the number at 287,000 per unit over the last 4 years. The question, I suppose, and it does kind of take some of the questions that are from the audience, how do we leverage the skills, experience and expertise of the private sector while giving value for money for the taxpayer?
So the first thing I'll say is the only people who build houses are the private sector. Private builders build all of the houses in the state, whether they're developed by private developers, approved housing bodies, or local authorities. And I'm not suggesting that should change. The issue is who is the developer. And I think this is an important distinction we need to understand. The figures in the Irish Times article were wrong. And I can provide anybody who's interested with the accurate figures. So the average all-in development cost of houses and apartments where the local authority is the developer, so not turnkeys or not acquisition is 239,000 euros, and that includes land cost and site servicing cost as well. The Society of Chartered Surveyors report, which they published a couple of weeks ago, they make the point that for the very same unit of accommodation, the public sector can deliver the same unit for 140,000 euros less. Now, that's because they treat issues such as land differently, and they have lower costs of finance, and obviously no profit or developer's margin. So for me, it's not a question of saying pitting the private sector against the public sector. This goes back to Ronan's graph near the end, where he talked about, the A, people who are in subsidized social housing, the C group who can afford the full market cost, and that B group in the middle. And he's absolutely right. What I'm saying is that the best way to meet the housing needs of that C group is an intermediary type of housing, which isn't the same as traditional social housing, but nor is it fully fledged market. And the best placed mechanisms to deliver that are non-market mechanisms in terms of the developer. And that's, I suppose, the case I'm making. And at the center of this is saying, let's stop talking about social housing, because Ronan is right. I mean, there are really only two types of housing, market and non-market. But social housing has a particular meaning in an Irish context. If we start to talk about public housing developments that have the income and tenure mix built into them, but are developed by local authorities, approved housing bodies, community housing trusts and others, you can get all of the benefits that Ronan outlines, but you could do it in a much more cost-effective way. And that would mean, for example, about half of all completions would be of that non-market kind, mixing what we currently understand as social rental, affordable purchase. The other half would be private, with the Part 5 element mixed in to have tenure mix as well. And therefore you have both sections, the market and non-market section, collaborating, working together and meeting different sections of needs within the society overall.
Thanks, Eoin. Does Michelle or Ronan or Daniel want to add anything to that? Okay, I'll move on to the next topic, and maybe I'll go to Ronan first, and then if Daniel and Michelle want to come in after that, and that's on this issue of construction costs. I mean, Ronan, you brought it up in your presentation that Ireland seems to be out of line with the rest of Europe. Specifically in terms of the hard costs, the taxes element of it, the delivery mechanisms, the funding mechanisms. What specifically could be done to reduce those costs?
Yeah, and obviously I talk about this quite a bit, and one of the first reactions is, well, like the land market here is messed up, and I absolutely, but it's excluding land costs, it's still there. And then other people say, well, what about the VAT on new homes? And well, the VAT rate's higher in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam is cheaper. I think you can whittle away at all the non-hard cost bits, and you're still left with the fact that we can certainly reform the other bits. If the VAT rate is out of line with a whole basket of other countries, we can change the VAT rate. It's not going to solve the problem, though. We're going to be left with the underlying hard construction costs on a like-for-like basis. It doesn't really matter whether it's built for a local authority, a housing body, or a for-profit developer. It is expensive to build, and it's particularly expensive to build for older, smaller urban households, which is what the focus is. What's the root cause? I suspect part of it comes back to, incidentally, I don't buy the idea that we were fine up until the bubble and then we lost all the housing sector capacity, or construction capacity. I think the office space, the hotel space, the student accommodation space have shown a capacity can come to Ireland at the drop of a hat if viability is there, and viability is not there. So the issue is not about the capacity, it's not about the small size of the economy. It may be partly to do with the fact that we never built apartments viably, and we're learning how to do this for the first time, unlike Vienna, which was doing this in the 1930s. We never had to build in brownfield city centre locations at higher density. We just kind of always went further out on the greenfield. But so that's on the sector to learn how to do it well and cheaply. But I also think there's an onus on the government. I'm going to pick something which I suspect many people would go, why are you going to pick on this? But say the net energy efficient, zero net energy efficient requirement, right? And it's a great idea as long as policy takes countervailing measures to make sure you're not pricing out lower income households. If you introduce this measure and you increase the break-even cost of housing by say €20,000 per unit, and that prices out 2% of households who otherwise would be able to afford, you need to take some countervailing policy measure. And there's never really been a comprehensive regulatory impact assessment of all the changes and rules that came since the bubble and crash. And I can understand why local authorities and national policymakers responded to what they saw getting built in the bubble with a whole raft of new regulations. The news for them is if they had only implemented the regulations they had at the time, they wouldn't have seen that getting built. So it's not necessarily about more regulations, it's about having the regulations and enforcing them, and where you want more regulations, making sure that you're not pricing out lower income households.
Michelle?
I agree with Ronan on the impact of regulation. There's been an enormous amount of new regulations introduced in recent years, all of them individually laudable, but the issue is their collective impact. So, for instance, electricians are now regulated and have to sign off on your rewiring. Architects are now heavily regulated. There's building regulations around energy efficiency, and the issue is, as I said, the collective impact and the need for a robust analysis of their collective impact compared to the benefits they generate, and comparing the costs and benefits. Another issue I feel is that there's very, very little use of modern building techniques and system building in residential development in Ireland. And it is very widely used in office development. It is very widely used in hotel development. And building a hotel compared to building an apartment block is not that different. And I think if we are going to look at trying to build a cost rental sector, as Eoin's mentioned, we're going to have to both look at, how this can be subsidised, addressing the land, but also how we can get the costs of construction down. And part of it is the use of more modern building techniques and systems building are more widely used in other countries compared to Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Okay, Eoin, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, let me argue against both Michelle and Ronan. First of all, we have a very poor history of properly regulating building control in this state. I mean, if you go back, for example, and read when the building control bills were being debated in the 80s and early 90s, the industry told us we couldn't have insulation in our homes because it would make the delivery of suburban semi-detached homes unviable. And as a result of a very weak regulatory culture, we have huge volumes of properties that don't meet basic energy standards, fire standards, and disability standards. Now, some of that improved in 2014, although it's too early to say. But also, when you look at the data, so go back and look at the Society of Chartered Surveyors reports. They've released one this year. They've done two previously on apartment builds and house builds, and they have another apartment build one coming out later this year. What they show is, while absolutely our hard costs are marginally above some of our comparable states, our big problem is in the soft costs. And we need to have a serious conversation about what do we do about those soft costs. And in real terms, you either decide to take a cut, and a large cut, out of the tax revenues, whether development levies, compliance costs, or VAT, or you look at land, finance, and margin. And again, this is the reason why I'm saying we need to look at an intermediary model rather than the social delivery or the market delivery, because the scale of the cost reduction we need to deliver genuine affordability for working people is in the region of that €140,000 per unit differential the Society of Chartered Surveyors identified. And they're based on real costs on real projects. And that's why I think we need something different in this. It can't be a market minus a discount. It has to be something much, much more profound. And Ronan is right. I mean, it is more expensive for us to build the apartments, but we can build really good quality public or non-market apartment developments in the centre of Dublin, for example. St Michael's Estate in Inchicore is going to be the pilot project of this. And we can rent them out for €700 to €900 a month on a full cost recovery basis over 50 years if the state wants to do that. That's for working the singles that Ronan is talking about, or the young professional couples, or people at a later point in the life cycle. So there are ways of doing this, but we need to be really honest about how do we make that substantial cost reduction. And if anybody thinks piling on a second loan of €85,000 to a hard-pressed single person or working couple is the way to do that, I think they're forgetting the lessons of the last time we had a property bubble.
Okay. The next issue that people wanted to ask about was the role of acquisitions. And maybe I'll come to Daniel first in this, because you did some work in this in relation to costs of the various schemes. One particular question was, what is the impact on price inflation as a result of the state buying these homes? So it's an increased demand. You could probably say the same thing about the private rental sector, actually, which is a kind of another question. Is there anything you can say about that aspect of it in terms of the actual impact of the state on rents or prices?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dermot. So in terms of the work we did on the acquisitions and the impact on the wider market, it is kind of, just from a technical point of view, quite hard in terms of assessing it. You need a lot of data in terms of, if we think about the housing market, there's very significant differences in prices spatially. So even within a town, different parts of the town will have very different price trends, and we scale that up to the country. It's absolutely very significant. So I suppose the work that we've done in the area, I suppose all we were able to look at is of the private market transactions, what proportion of those is the state involved with in terms of second-hand acquisitions. And as I mentioned during the presentation, on average it's around 4%, but there are, when you look at it at a postcode level, there are particular areas of the country where that goes up to 10, 15%. And although that was as far as we're able to go in terms of the data availability, you would, I suppose, expect that where there's a greater level of acquisitions in an area, there's a greater potential for a price impact on the market. But unfortunately, it's not something that we've been able to assess in enough detail to kind of to show it one way or the other. I think you're right in the second point you mentioned. I suppose it's not just the acquisitions, it's across the delivery mechanisms. Thinking about what impact they have on the rest of the housing market on prices is really important consideration. But it's not something that we've been able to get to a really definitive answer about. So perhaps an area for future research.
Okay. So in relation to the issue of the state playing a more active role, which seems to be obviously the direction we're moving in general in Ireland, just maybe for the panel to finish up, because we have 4 minutes left, and maybe I'll leave this question and ask each of you to maybe respond to it. How do we put the infrastructure in that the state is able to do this? Like, Eoin, in your book, you talked about the National Building Agency back in the 70s, which is there. You're proposing that agency effectively be set up again, but we don't really have any experience and data in relation to how efficiently the state can produce these homes. It may take some time to do that. It may take some years, but in the interim period, those housing needs, that housing demand is still there. How do we do it quicker?
Well, and just to come back quickly on the acquisitions, just so people know that the Department of Housing's acquisitions program has virtually ended. So there's virtually no acquisitions permitted by local authorities this year. But also, because there's been a little bit of kind of misreporting in the media, local authorities in the main never competed on the private market. They were either buying vacant properties that were already tenant with RAS tenants, or properties that weren't on the market. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, by the way, but the Department of Housing's rules prevented local authorities from actually going out and purchasing properties that had for sale signs on them in the main, although there are some exceptions. Look, nobody today has the capacity to deliver the volume of homes that we need, no matter whose model you look at, whether that's the private sector, whether it's the public sector, or the AHB sector. So if we're going to build the volume of homes that are required, all sectors need to increase their capacity. I'm not in favour of a single state agency for the delivery of public homes. The National Building Agency didn't work, and I don't believe a single state agency will do. We have regional housing systems. The housing system in the southwest and the southeast is fundamentally different from Dublin and the commuter belt, etc. So what we need at a public level, because we know the state can directly control that through investment, particularly at a time of counter-cyclical need, for the state to have ambitious 5-year housing programs for public housing. That's employing private builders, but that is developing out good quality mixed income, mixed tenure estates, again in whatever model. And I think if the state leads by investment, the homes will follow. Because the one thing I will say is, with the exception of one or two, almost all local authorities have met the Rebuilding Ireland delivery targets through the variety of delivery streams Daniel had said there. The problem is some of those delivery streams are inefficient, some are too expensive, and the targets simply aren't ambitious enough. So I think regional plans, the Housing Delivery Agency in the CCMA is a good body, but it needs more resourcing. But we also need to have a conversation, which probably is for another day, about how the state can work with private developers to bring the price of the other half of our housing delivery streams down as well. But I've no doubt, just as it happened, for example, in the 40s, 50s and 60s, if the state takes the decision to double capital investment, clean up the public spending code and deliver the kind of housing that Ronan and I both agree on in terms of its typology and tenure, then that housing can be delivered. It'll take a bit of time, but it'll be a damn sight faster than what we've had up until this point.
Maybe on to Michelle.
I agree with Eoin that I don't see the need for a national agency. And I read the Irish Times article that included some allegations that local authorities have different allocation systems, have different systems in loads of areas, which is not my understanding of the situation. They're separate bodies, but regulated by national legislation. So I don't accept the argument that there's lots of inefficiencies between them. I think the local authorities have the capacity to deliver if land is made available to them, and also if there are reforms made to the approval process from the Department of Housing that are committed to in the programme for government, and in my view are unnecessarily onerous and slow the process. And also after the various stages of approval are met, the project goes out to tender, because as Eoin mentioned, that the private sector builds all of this. The project goes out to tender, so that the tender price is the cost, you know. So that's one side of it. In the AHB sector, the AHB sector has significantly increased its output of dwellings in recent years, but not necessarily its level of construction from scratch. And I think there is an issue just around the structure of the AHB sector, which is a challenge in that regard. So there are 200 and something AHBs. Some of them are very small organizations with no paid staff that provide very valuable voluntary services. But there's not enough large AHBs in the development space that have enough staff and specialist staff to do housing development from scratch. So I think that's something we would be worth encouraging through whatever mechanism that we trying to encourage a larger number of AHBs to get involvement in development, maybe by some amalgamations of organizations. We have currently about 6 or 7 AHBs that are very active in development, and a smaller number that are active in construction, and we should be aiming to have 10 to 12 in my view.
Ronan, a few brief last words?
Yeah, I'll disagree a little bit. I think the state is the referee, it sets the rules. The state is the funder, it provides the income supports, social housing. I don't think it can also be the provider. I think the past track record proves that. It ends up selling them all for something else. I think NAM is a great example of where you end up as a provider and you become a competitor. And I don't think we should have the state competing with all sorts of other agencies. I completely agree with Michelle on the idea of let's have 10 to 12 large non-profit agencies providing social housing. Let's have 10 to 12 large for-profit. And there's going to be a long tail of smaller ones doing little bits and pieces. But the state, I think, should keep itself to setting the rules, setting the income supports, and stepping back. And if the system is not delivering, the state has to accept responsibility that the rules it has set in some way are the cause of the problem and fix those. Either it's a market failure or a policy failure, recognize which it is and fix it. Thanks for listening.
Daniel, final word?
Yeah, I suppose just to add maybe a final point, I suppose just in building the evidence base around these different questions, I think is really important. So understanding cost efficiency across different delivery mechanisms, understanding different considerations around land availability, around how housing support is targeted, and developing, I suppose, data availability around those is really important and can help, I suppose, push the conversation along as we continue to consider the different options.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Ronan. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Eoin. Really appreciate it. At the peak, I think we are up to about 500 or so participants. So it just shows you the interest in this particular topic. I think the recording will be available on YouTube probably by some stage tomorrow. And we will be making the slides available as well. Thanks for all for coming on board. We have another 5 sessions over the next 4 days. Tomorrow on the very, very important issue of the labour market. So hopefully as many as possible can tune in at that time. Thanks all, and see you all soon.